Hey guys, today we'll be continuing with the Python video tutorials. I'll be working on nested loops again. So this is another nested loops example. We'll print a pattern using stars. So here we'll have we'll just have a rows variable. We'll say rows points to cast it into the input function. We'll ask for a prompt how many rows. Then we'll create a columns variable as well. We'll ask how many columns. And here we'll nest two for loops. So here we'll have for. Actually, I think you have to do this. For I in range rows. We'll say for j in range columns. Something wrong with that. Does that work? Okay, so maybe we could do so like that. Actually, I don't know if we need that. No, that's fine. So let's see. Doesn't like these. I don't think it likes these initialized. Okay, so let's just create a new variable. Actually, let's just use doesn't like. Yeah, it should be fine for. Or doesn't like these brackets. Maybe let's try that. Okay, I think that's it. So we don't need to initialize them to 0. It's not liking these brackets for some reason. Why is that? Didn't I do that last time? Indent expected. Yeah, so it's waiting for something else here. Let's just see what we have here. So let's just say so we'll print so we'll print here an asterisk. We'll have a comma and then we'll say end equals because we don't want to space them. We don't want to space them out. Then here we'll just print a new line. So let's try that. Is it giving me an error? No. Okay, so we should be able to put some brackets here. some parentheses around this. I might not like that. Let's try that. Oh, still give me an error. So, yeah, I don't think it likes those brackets. Let's see. Can you do 4 here, like this? Nope, it just doesn't like those parentheses in Python, so that's okay. So we'll just leave the parentheses out for a while. You can still do them. I thought we did do it last time. There might be a way. Forgot how I did it last time, so that's fine. Let's just see what this prints. No, is there's forgetting the indent here. I'll save and run that. How many rows? Let's just say 5. How many columns? 5. Okay, so that's not gonna... It should have printed out a pattern here. Well, one sec, sorry. No, sorry, I was talking to my cat. Let's see here. So we have our asterisks. Maybe no space there, and equals a space. Let's try that. Sorry, the text in my notes is super hard to read, so I can't see what they wrote here. There should be... Let me just open it up on my phone just to see. Apologize for this. I'm using this on Amazon Kindle, but like if you blow it up on a computer the size, it doesn't even, like the text all the pixels get all blurry. So I'm just trying to see what I wrote here. Alright, so let's open this picture that I took. Alright, so let's see, we have, okay, so it's just, yeah, that should be correct. Print. So we have, rows points to int, cast it int to input how many rows, question mark. Maybe a new line here. It's weird how it does a new line sometimes and it doesn't otherwise. Alright, so we'll just go with that. How many rows, how many columns for R in range rows. Or we did I for I in range rows for... Maybe this is supposed to be out here. For I in range rows, for J in range columns, print star, comma, space, and with a nothing. Okay, nothing in there. Just like that. We'll try that here. There's a way to do it. I've done this in other languages. It's the same thing. There's just I might have to actually open those notes that I have. Oh, there we go. Okay, so that was it. So what happened here? Can we do 2 by 2? 2 by 2 might work. Then we can step through. Just to show how I got. So this is the problem here. You need this. So this print statement here, it actually spaces them out, so you can print a 2D array like this. I know you guys don't know what that is yet. Well, most of you won't if you're just learning programming. So an array, I guess in Python, is a list, so you can print data like this in square brackets with like each index. It's like a matrix. If you know what a matrix is, I don't even know what a matrix ever. I don't even think I learned about those, but basically, the first row is 0. So there's rows. It goes rows, which go left to right and then down. Actually, no, I lied. It goes rows up to down and then columns left to right. So two-dimensional arrays are they're called 2D arrays in programming. They're like that, rows by columns. So on index 0, you can go line by line. So index 0, comma 2 would be row 0, column 2. So that's what it's really happening here, except we're not using an array, so it's the same concept. So in the loop prints, we start at index 0 here. Once we're in the first iteration for the outer loop, we go to the since we're in the range of the rows still, this condition's true. We step in here to the next for loop. In the inner for loop, j starts at index 0, but j is going to iterate completely. So because this is rows here, right? Well, yeah, we have rows here and columns here. Oh, whoops. Comment done and with that number sign. Hashtag. Okay, so we got so during index 0 for rows, which is an iteration, so during i's 0th iteration, or iteration 0, which is the first one, j will iterate, or j or index, so let's just say rows, which is I index 0, then columns j index iterates like fully, it iterates fully 0 to columns minus 1, right? Let's just that just means dash here, or I could just say here 0 to columns minus 1. So j iterates. What happened here? So here columns are gonna, so for every iteration of I, so every one iteration of I, like every full, no, so not full, but every one iteration, only one. So let's just say iteration 0, index 0, right, of I, its first iteration, which is the outer loop, right, because this is the outer loop, this is the outer for loop. For every iteration of the outer for loop, the inner for loop iterates completely. If that makes sense, like it fully iterates. So it's going to complete its full iteration 0 to columns minus 1. So since we did columns equals 2, it's going to iterate twice. It's going to do iteration 0 and then iteration 1. So that's 2 full iterations for every one iteration of the outer for loop, if that makes sense. So we'll just put a breakpoint here to show that. I'll save it and click the debugger. So how many rows? We said 2. I'll hit enter. You can see in our variables that we have rows points to 2, which is an int in our variables. Then I'll step in to this other print here. Sorry, not print. I'll step into this other input function for columns. Step over. Now it's waiting for input. I'll enter 2 again. I'll hit enter. Now we're in the outer for loop. So for I in range rows 2, so I in range 2 minus 1, starting at 0, so I in range 0 to rows minus 1 basically, which is 0 to 2 minus 1, so 0 is, so it's going to iterate twice, 0 and 1. So we'll step in, and you can see I will be equal to 0. So now this outer for loop was true because we're still in range for the rows. We're still in range. Rows is 2, we're at iteration 0, so it would be rows minus 1, so 2 minus 1. So it iterate twice. This is true, we step into the inner for loop. For j in range columns minus 1, which is true because columns is 2. We're starting at iteration 0 since this is the first iteration of the loop. We'll step in. Then we'll have, so now we have I and j both hints pointing to 0. Then we'll print a star here with no space after the print. That's all that the end's saying. So if I step over that in the console, we'll see a star. Now j, so after that print statement, the inner for loop is finished because we have this print being indented back here, meaning that it's not part of the loop, right? So in that case, after the end of this line, it loops back up here. Follow the cursor here. See my cursor? It just goes under here, back up here to the for loop here. Now in the for loop, we're going to check this condition again. So now we're going to add 1 to 0. So 0 plus 1 is 1. So it's going to say for j, which is now 1 in range. So you substitute the 1 for the j. So then we say for j, which is 1 in range columns. So columns is 2 minus 1. So now so 1 is still in range of 2 minus 1. So now it's at the last iteration because it's equal. So 1 is equal to 2 minus 1. In this case, it'll still get one more iteration because it's not less than 1. We didn't specify it to be less than 1 for the loop condition. In this case, if you're using the range, it can be equal to the last. It can still be equal to this case. Hopefully I'm not confusing anyone. That's probably not the best thing to say. The best thing to say is just that j is still less than columns minus 1 in this case because 1 is less than 2 minus 1. So that means this loop condition is still true. So then we'll proceed to the next line. Step in. So now we're here. If we check our variables, we have j is now pointing to 1. As you can see, I is still 0 because we're still in that first iteration of I, of the outer loop. It's only its 0th iteration still. And like I said before, the j index, the loop index has to iterate fully 0 to columns minus 1, right? So columns is 2, 2 minus 1, 1. So we're on the last iteration now. So print the star with a no space. So we printed a star, so we printed an asterisk here beside the other asterisk, no space. Now we went back up, the print statement was done. We went back up to the loop here, check the condition again this time for j, which is now going to be 2 if we add 1, because every time it adds 1. So for j in range 2 minus 1, because columns is 2 and minus 1 is range because you have to minus 1 from the last range, the ending range. That means for 2 in range 2 minus 1. So is 2 equal to 1? No, it's greater than 1. So in this case, now this loop condition is false. So what happens after this loop condition is false? Then we follow the mouse cursor back. Since the loop's done, we have to exit the loop. So to exit the loop, if the condition's false, we just follow the mouse cursor here. Here's my mouse cursor, if you can see it, the gray thing. Right at the end of columns, it's going to go back under the loop, back up here in this case because this one's done. So we need to get back up to the outer loop. And we start here, and we're going to check this condition again. And now we're going to add 1 to I, because I was 0. Now we'll say I equals I plus 1, so we'll go 0 equals 0 plus 1. So now we have for I, which is 1, in range rows, which is 2 minus 1. So it'll still get at least one full iteration. So now we step in. If we check our variables, then we have I is equal to, what happened here? Did I step over something? Yeah, I think, oh, okay, yeah, whoops, sorry. Okay, I apologize for that. So after this line, so we just had one more little step before that. I forgot about this print. So we had this outer loop here, right? So this print is still part of that outer loop. So after this print, after the print, the inner statement. So after this inner loop iterated completely, we went over that. We had to just proceed to this line because the print statement was still part of this outer loop. So before this loop iterates from 0 to 1, it just has to print a line here, a print statement. So what's really happening is, if you see my cursor here, so it's going to just end that print here and start back here. So this hopefully I didn't confuse anyone here. So we just have the we have for I is equal to 0 in I's first iteration. After this iterates completely, execution was here. Instead of going back up here, like I said, we just have to start here. So in that case, we have to print one line before we get back up here. So it just prints to the next line here. So the print statement executes once we printed that last asterisk in this loop. That was done since this was false. So once this condition's false, we just have to go here, print a space, then we follow the cursor back up here. Then we check this condition. Apologize about that, forgot about that print statement. Then when I step, so it hasn't iterated yet. It hasn't iterated yet, so we have to take we take I equals, in this case, 0. So the thing is, when these loops iterate, it doesn't actually add 1 to I until you step in. So once you step in, so think about that it's basically has added it already. Because you have to check the loop condition, but the thing about debugging is it doesn't update it till after you actually step in. So you can pretend like it actually added 1 to I right now. So we'll go for I is equal to 0 plus 1, because now we're on the second, we're going to start the second iteration. So we'll say for I, which is now I equals I plus 1, so I is now 1. For 1 in range rows, which is 2 minus 1. So we still have another full iteration. I'll step in. Then now I will add 1, as you can see in the variables. Then this process will continue. So in this case, now this inner loop starts completely over again, if that makes sense. So the inner loop has to completely restart. So it starts back up at index 0 in this case. So for 0, so J, which is 0, in range columns, which is 2 minus 1, which is true because J is 0, so J is still in range, we'll step in. We check our variables here, we can see that J now equals to 0, I is now 1, right? So we're in I's last iteration, which is the outer loop, and we're in J's first iteration, because once the outer loop starts a new iteration, the inner loop will automatically have to start a new iteration. So hopefully you guys understand that. So now we'll print this asterisk again, starting at, so the what happened here is we really moved from row 0 to row 1, because this is rows. I tracks the rows. So if we're printing this pattern in a 2D, two-dimensional structure, then we have moved from row 0, index 0, which is really the first row, to index 1, right? So now we're starting at index 0, comma 0, which means row index 0, comma column index 0, because columns go left to right, rows go up to down. So now we've moved down to the next row, and now we're starting at the first column, right here, under this one. So now we're going to print an asterisk here. So I'm going to step over this line, is going to print an asterisk in that row and column that we just said, with no space as we specified there, with that end equals nothing. There we go, so we got our asterisk here. So now, where are we actually? Yeah, so after that we were here, then we went back up to check the inner loop condition again. In that case, J is gonna, once we, well yeah, it's really happening now, but we haven't executed this line, so you have to actually execute the line. But you can think that basically now we add 1 to J, so J equals J plus 1. So we take J equal in our variables, you can see it's an int, points to 0. So we say, okay, well, J equals J plus 1, or you increment it, right, by 1, which just means add 1 to J. Excuse me. So we, so J equals J plus 1, so for J we can substitute 1, so for 1 in range columns, which is 2 minus 1, so for 1 in range 1, which is still in range, it's equal, so it's still in range. If it's equal, it's in range, so just remember that. But it has to be, make sure you subtract 1 from the ending range. So we'll step in because it's true. I think it's true, yeah, it's true. So then we'll print the asterisk. So now J, if we check the variables, we have J points, so now J is gonna, yeah, so J points to 1 now, because we incremented by 1. That's its last iteration, so both should be 1. I is on its 1 iteration, and J is on its 1 iteration, which is really the second iteration. So now we'll print another asterisk beside, so the one in row 1, comma 0, that's where this asterisk got printed, the one we just printed. We're going to add 1 to the column. That's what J is. So the index is going to go from 0 to 1, so because now we're in iteration 1, right? So we're going to print the asterisk at row 1, comma 1, right in that empty space here, beside the first one. There we go. So we printed it in row 1, comma column 1, row 1, comma column 1, right? Make sure you know that though, because you're going to be using those in programming with 2D arrays. So you have to know the row column structure, you have to know the index 0 and how they move like that. 0, 1, how they move down first, then across. So it has to check the row first, then the column. So I always set my row to I and J to column, just to remember that. So now in this case we have J equals to 1 in range 2 minus 1, but now we have to add 1 to J. So if we add 1 to J, then J becomes J equals J plus 1, so 1 equals 1 plus 1, which is 2, or J equals 1 plus 1, which is 2. Then we say for 2 in range columns, which is 2 minus 1, so is 2 in range 2 minus 1? Is 2 in range 2 minus 1? is 2 in range 2. Yeah, sorry, is 2 in range 1, basically. It's not, because 2 is greater than 1. So in this case now loop condition is false. So hopefully I'm not going to confuse anyone here, just to what happened last time, no one gets confused, is that after this inner loop we still have this print statement to execute after, which is in the outer loop, so it's going to jump down here. Because this inner loop was finished in normal code processing, when you have blocks of code under a loop that's complete, it can't iterate anymore, it's now false, or otherwise it's now false. It can't continue in that loop, the loop has stopped. In that case, there's one of two things that can happen. So basically you proceed to the next line of code, if there's a line of code, which would be out of the inner loop, right? It has to be out of in Python, has to be out of the indentation here. So this indentation here, there can't be anything below the print in the same indentation. It has to be in this indentation in the condition. So it has to be out of that indentation, so you have to make sure it's out of that tab. Then if there's code here, it's going to execute the next line of code, which in this case it's still part. So this line of code here is part of this for loop here, the outer for loop, right? If there was no code here, then it would continue back up here. This wouldn't happen because there would be no code here. If there's no code after this inner for loop and this inner for loop's done, then the execution of the code goes back to the outer for loop. But since there is a line here of code, which is part of the outer for loop, that has to execute first. So we're going to execute this print line. So hopefully that clears up any confusion. So I'll execute that. So what happened? So what really happened is that it got pretty much, it printed a new line here underneath that asterisk to start a new row basically. But in this case we have I is equal to 1, right? So this is our last iteration. So for I, which is now 1 in range 2 minus 1, since that already happened, we have to add 1 to I. So now I equals I plus 1. So I equals 1 plus 1. So now I equals 2. So for 2 in range 1, because rows is 2 minus 1. So for 2 in range 1, which is false because I is now out of the range, that means this loop is false, or complete in this case. That means we can't proceed into this loop again. That means since this loop is false, this print statement is in that loop, so we couldn't execute this. That means the code's done. There's nothing more to execute. So we have exit code 0, no errors. So this is pretty much this is how nested loops go. This is as far as we'll go with nested loops. That's the concept. Hopefully that's a good explanation. It is complicated to understand, especially these Python for loops are pretty advanced, to be honest. It doesn't show you how much it's really incrementing by. You have to know the range function, and yeah, it doesn't, like for another, I'll just show you, for another language you write your for loops like this. So you'd be like, so we're like in Java and C, you go for I is equal to 0. So that means you know that it starts at 0, right? So these ones, they don't even tell you, you just have to know automatically. You have to memorize it. In C and Java, they explicitly, you can start your loops however you want, basically. Well, you could initialize I to something here at the top. But if you're just saying for I, you can create a variable like this on the fly in a loop. without even initializing it. It's just something you have to memorize. That's also confusing. But here we say, we'll be like, okay, well, I is going to be less than or equal to how many times we iterate 2. Then we'll say I plus plus, which means I equals I plus 1. Python doesn't have a plus plus, I think. So this is how a normal for loop would work in most languages. They also have a for each loop, which is basically like this in Java. So you can have for each. Same thing. For this in whatever. It's basically the exact same thing as this. But a for each loop is advanced. So this is easy. This tells you I'm starting at 0. I'm starting at I equals to 0. This is my start condition. My end condition is I is less than or equal to 2. That means I'm going to iterate 3 times in this case, so I'll make this 1. So this loop here would be equivalent to this loop right here if we set rows to 2 again. This means for I is equal to 0, so it's starting at 0. I is less than or equal to 1. That means it's going to iterate twice. Start at 0, do a full iteration. Start at 1, do a full iteration. We're going to add 1. That means on the third iteration it's going to be false. So these are the standard for loops in most languages. So this loop here is advanced. So if you're learning it, it's pretty much hard to understand. If you're brand new to coding, it's pretty advanced. But hopefully this video helps. So we're just going to end nested loops here. This is as hard as it gets. I mean, you could have a triple nested loop, right? You could have 4 of them, 5 of them. It's the same idea. You just step through them. So the inner loop, just remember the inner loop's going to iterate completely before its next level of the outer loop. And if there's another level, that has to iterate completely before the next level outside. So if you're stuck, again, just set a breakpoint, walk through the debugger like I showed you. I've done it in almost every video. Walking through the debugger a lot. I know a lot of videos on YouTube, they never walk through the debugger. Never. If you're learning to code just with the run button, it's not going to work. It's not going to work well. If you really want to learn it, you have to step through the debugger. That way you know how the process is working each time. You can see how the variables are changing. Right? Well, there's none here now, but just do that. And I've even I know this channel isn't that big right now, but I've had the videos that I have been watched a lot. Like some of the data structure videos in Java, I was able to help a lot of people by showing them how you can step through the code in the debugger, and because a lot of people, when they write code, especially in old compilers, you can't step through like this. So even in Visual Studio, like if you try to step through code, sometimes like in Java it might have worked, but in C it didn't work. Some of the methods they wouldn't let me step into them. It would just start running the code without letting me see what's happening. So JetBrains is really good with that. Not IntelliJ. So in PyCharm you can do it perfectly. You can step through everything. It's really good. The Python interpreter is better than C, but not as I think you can show global variables. We'll get into that pretty soon. But yeah, it's pretty good. So if you're learning to code, do what I do. So set breakpoints. Step through, step in to each function, each line of code to the loop. So that's how you learn it properly. That's how I learned it. That's how I was able to learn it. Because if you just try writing this out and you try to do it in your head through a run, just by running it, you're not going to get it. You're going to be like, okay, well, I iterated once, so then this iterated once, okay, it was done. You're not going to know. So that's the best way to do it. Hopefully that helps you guys. If you guys like the video, you can give me a thumbs up, and you can subscribe to the channel for more programming videos and investing stuff. And I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Take care. Thanks for watching.